And then, yeah, whenever you want to.
I guess let's start. No, it's noon.
I'm going to hit the button.
Okay. So I guess we can, yeah, people are still joining, but yeah, let's start. Okay. Oh, people are, so I'll wait a little bit more, less than a minute, people are still joining. Okay. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, depending from where you're joining us, and welcome for our first actually seminar for this year for the FLUXNet Early Career Network seminar series. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you for our speakers who are joining us today to talk more about monitoring and modeling natural greenhouse gas emissions from the Arctic. And as always, thank you for AmeriFlux Management Project for sponsoring our seminar series. So today we are going to hear from Dr. Oliver Sonnentag and Dr. Kyle Arndt to learn more about what they do in the Arctic. So I will be introducing Oliver, and then we will have a presentation followed by questions. Please feel free to write the question in the chat. I'll read them at the end, or just say them out loud, and then I'll handle it for Yumi, who's hosting the seminar, to introduce Kyle and monitor the questions. So let's start with our first presentation. So first, we'd like to welcome Dr. Sonnentag. Oliver is an associate professor and Canada Research Chair in Atmospheric Biogeosciences in High Latitude at the Université de Montréal. Dr. Sonnentag works on understanding changes in surface atmosphere interactions across Arctic-boreal regions in response to changing climate and permafrost conditions. So today we're going to hear more about his work at Scotty Creek, the site of Scotty Creek, to understand where he works on understanding interactions between wildfires and permafrost thaw using nested eddy covariance measurement. So without further ado, thank you for joining us, Oliver, and yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for the nice introduction. So yeah, I'll be talking about Scotty Creek. Some of you might know the site through FLUXNet or AmeriFlux, known as CA-CSCC. And 20, I'll explain later why. 20, why this is our second attempt or our second round of understanding Scotty Creek, to better understand interactions between wildfire and permafrost thaw using a nested eddy covariance setup. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge many funding organizations and universities and collaborators across Canada, different territories and provinces, etc. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time to go into detail here, but yeah, thanks to all the support over the years. And my main focus is on the work my group's been doing for the last 10, 12 years now in the Northwest Territories, mostly in the Northwest Territories. And in about 2011, 2012, my group started adding towers to pretty much a site well established in the mid-90s as part of Boreas, and then later on berms in FLUXNet, Canada, initiated by Andy Black and collaborators, the Southern Oak Black Spruce site at the southern limit of the boreal forest in Canada. And over the years, as we can see here on this map, my group's been adding different eddy covariance towers along what looks like a more or less complete transect from the southern tree line to the northern tree line of the boreal of Western Canada, boreal forest of Western Canada. I mean, this arrangement, spanning around 2,000 kilometers, follows more or less was more rather unplanned climate and permafrost gradient. Southern old black spruce being located in this near the southern limit of boreal forest or the southern tree line without permafrost. And then as we go further north, we see that different sites are characterized by different, are located in different permafrost zones, from isolated and sporadic permafrost over discontinuous permafrost to continuous permafrost. And then we see, the northern tree line with our northernmost site called Trail Valley Creek, which is just above the tree line further south of the northern tree line, Havik Creek. And then as we go further south, we have Smith Creek, the SMC, and then the site I'd be talking a little bit more about, the Scotty Creek site, or known as SCC. And then to the south, outside the permafrost, so we have the Southern Old Black, the well-established, and I'm sure many of you have heard about this site or worked with data from this site, the Southern Old Black Spruce. So our main focus at Scotty Creek is we're using a nested eddy covariance setup. So the idea was, in the headwater portion of the circa 150 square kilometer basin, we have what we refer to as our landscape tower, or SCC, the Scotty Creek, well, our main tower at Scotty Creek, that sees a pretty heterogeneous landscape comprising boreal forest with permafrost and permafrost-free thermokarst wetlands. And then nested within this footprint, or the footprint of this 50-meter landscape tower, we have a shorter tower that sees fluxes originating only from the thermokarst wetland. And again, it's a very heterogeneous landscape. It is thawing quite rapidly. So, and with permafrost thaw, associated with permafrost thaw, we have this loss of boreal forest and replacement of boreal forest by wetland. So the forest, or the percentage of forest, is decreasing, but the proportion of wetland is increasing, so expanding. It's a pretty challenging site. It's a remote site in the summer or in the growing season. We are between May, June-ish, and July, August, September. We have to, it's a fly-in site, so we can access the site by float plane during freeze up and the melt period. It's accessible by helicopter only, and then in the winter we can access the site by snowmobile. So overall, it's a logistically challenging site. And our main activities are related to the Scotty Creek Research Camp. What we can see here, that we have in this typical low-lying peat landscape or peatland complex, part of it forested with permafrost, part of it thawed without permafrost. We have these sandy sandy hills. And that's where we established our main camp, the Scotty Creek Research Station. So what does this look like from an eddy covariance perspective? As I said, we're using a nested eddy covariance approach, or a nested instrumental setup. So we have a landscape scale tower here encircled in yellow, and then nested in the footprint of the taller tower, we have the shorter tower. And as I will refer later on to this one particular thermokarst wetland referred to as P-bog, and it will be clear in the next slide why we refer to this as P-bog. The overall landscape is thawing quite rapidly, as mentioned earlier. In a study previously previous study showed or suggested that by around the mid-2040s, this area, this overall landscape, including the eddy covariance thaw footprint, is going to be permafrost free. Right now, it's roughly 50-50. So the characteristics of the footprint, half of it has permafrost, around half of it is without permafrost. So as we can see here, this P-bog, or what we refer to as a P-bog, has a shape of a P. And the shorter tower sees fluxes originating from this P-bog. Here in the footprint, in the 90% footprint climatology, we can see the red circle, the red footprint of the P-bog tower, or the capturing or seeing fluxes originating from the thermokarst wetland. And then here in green, the 90% footprint climatology for this landscape scale tower that sees fluxes originating from the thermokarst wetlands, but also from intact boreal forest with permafrost. Over the years, quite a few studies have used data from both sides, and I just want to provide here an example from a PhD thesis. A former PhD student of mine published in Global Change Biology, pretty much looking at or teasing apart how do these thermokarst wetlands contribute to the overall landscape scale flux. And for example, this work by Manuel Helbig, published in 2017, shows that the net landscape scale methane flux increases with the extent of the permafrost-free wetland. And the magnitude is pretty much determined by, or it increased the temperature sensitivity of the landscape scale methane flux increases with the wetland extent. So obviously the wetland extent in with an increasing wetland extent, we can expect increasing methane emissions from this rapidly thawing landscape. So we started our work at Scotty Creek with this nested setup in 2013 when I installed, or when my group installed the landscape scale tower, and then later in 15 we added the thermokarst wetland tower. And I just see I made a mistake here. The thermokarst wetland started in June 2015 and the landscape scale tower started in 2013. So we have here in green the landscape, or what we refer to in this case as the plateau, because it sees the overall landscape, and the thermokarst wetland. In considering the challenges at the site, so it's off the grid, running it all off solar. Obviously, it's a challenging site to work at, also in terms of accessibility. We try our best, but we've been, pretty much reaching now a decade of flux measurements from this thawing thermokarst, or from this thawing peatland complex. Not surprisingly, 2019 or starting 2020 with COVID, it was challenging, right? We weren't allowed to access the site, but then later on 2021 it improved. We were considered as essential workers, so we had access to the Northwest Territories again. And so I think it's a pretty good data record now for such a challenging site in this nested setup. And then a few years ago, we also managed to get a good handle on the lateral flux, so how much carbon is transported laterally in runoff, by pretty much, measuring or monitoring runoff from the eddy covariance thaw footprint. So we mapped out the footprint and managed to capture in this very low-lying, low topography, low relief landscape, capture water flux to get at least a first-order handle on how much carbon is transported laterally. And combining our eddy covariance measurements with the laterally transported carbon, we were able to come up with a rough estimate of the net ecosystem carbon balance, and 5 years of data suggests that the site is currently carbon neutral in terms of the carbon balance, but clearly the net ecosystem carbon balance is dominated by net ecosystem exchange. So a recent study where we were interested in combining our eddy covariance measurements also with a paleoecology approach. So we looked at recent peat accumulation as following the re-establishment of different sphagnum species had this relatively stable period of permafrost peat plateaus. We managed to show how these sites, as a consequence of degrading peat plateaus, were re-established by sphagnum species, and they returned to peat accumulation. So when we think about permafrost thaw leading to increased emission, we also have to take into account that these sites start accumulating carbon again by the re-establishment or recolonization of different highly productive mosses. So to summarize Scotty Creek until now, it's definitely a well-established research basin near the southern limit of permafrost. In most research activities focused on the headwater portion near the Scotty Creek research camp. In more than 100 publications, shed light on how this rapidly thawing, rapidly changing landscape exchanges carbon, water, energy with the atmosphere. Quite a few studies led by collaborators looked at the hydrology. So what does permafrost thaw mean, or what are the consequences of permafrost thaw on hydrological functioning of this landscape? Paleoecology, biogeochemistry, in limnology, forest ecology, quite a bit of wildfire work, but also groundwater movement. And a few studies addressed or improved our understanding how to actually model such landscape. So overall, it's quite a data-rich environment. Sites data is accessible through AmeriFlux and FLUXNet. It is the northernmost site as part of the Forest Geo network. So right at the Scotty Creek Forest Geo plot led by Jen Balzer. The site has been extensively covered by the different NASA above airborne campaigns. So it's definitely a data-rich environment up to this point. But then, 2022 came, and with 2022, a lot of changes occurred at Scotty Creek. First of all, the site, and it might be the first one in North America for sure, that it was taken over by the Little Q First Nation, since we're the Scotty Creek Research Camp and all our research activities are happening on their land. So, right, it's the first First Nation-led research station in North America, as far as I know. In parallel, we managed to establish a training network to train locals, so Northerners, non-Indigenous and Indigenous, from nearby Fort Simpson, and trained them in basic micrometeorological measurement and how to maintain this instrumentation. We have a lot of support from Ameriflux. We have a lot of support from different instrument manufacturers and vendors. We had 2 training workshops in the NWT. And then October 2022, a late season wildfire pretty much destroyed Scotty Creek as we know it. So as we can see here, circled in red, and it was an unusually late season wildfire in October 2022. And we can see here, 2 of my team members were at Scotty Creek doing late season maintenance work. And we can see here, and we had in the upper left in the photo, the fire was approaching what looked like it's 10, 15, 20 kilometers away. And we were hoping, based on wind directions, that the fire would just move around. But it was this combination of sustained winds and changes in wind direction that pushed the fire right into Scotty Creek, the headwater portion. And we can see here in the distribution of wildfires for 2022, it was an unusually late fire in October that hit Scotty Creek. So I have a little animation produced by the Woodwell Climate Center. As we can see here, the fire, it started expanding from south of our tower sites in the Scotty Creek Basin. And then the sustained warm winds from the south, the fire increased and before it exploded, and then pretty much burned in total 90,000 hectares within a few days. And what does this look like? So to the left, we see the complete instrumental setup, right? An intact tower here, the Scotty SCC. And then nested inside, we have our smaller SCB, all nicely maintained and put together for 2022. So here we see a boardwalk we installed for chamber measurements. And then, that's what the site looked like after a few tower. I mean, the tower structure itself seems to be intact, but I mean, closer inspection showed, there was too much structural damage to the actual tower structure, right? It was not safe to climb anymore. And I guess the data logger speaks for itself. But surprisingly, and as we can see later in the next slide here, the data logger recorded until the very last minute, until the fire reached the tower and took down the tower and pretty much destroyed the entire setup. But the data, nothing happened to the cards. So a field technician visiting the site was able to collect the cards, and the fire pretty much burned the landscape scale tower SCC, but nothing happened to the shorter one because it's in a thermokarst wetland. So the fire mostly affected plateaus, but not the fully saturated wetlands. So as sad as it was, and the logistics and the legal and the aftermath of the fire was, it has kept me busy ever since October, that's for sure, but it's also an opportunity. So now we have an actively thawing landscape with a more or less solid data record for about 10 years, and then a wildfire comes through. And just here an example from David Ohlefeld's group, published in 2018, showing how wildfire increases permafrost, or the rate of permafrost thaw, and thus landscape changes, how it accelerates. And his study focused on the southern Taiga Plains, where the ecozone that includes Scotty Creek. So in my opinion, it's a unique opportunity to look at the interactions. How does wildfire interact with permafrost thaw, and what does this mean for land surface atmosphere interactions? So over the last few months, we worked hard on getting our hands on replacement equipment. And here a photo from in the upper left from last week. So with a local contractor, we built a scaffolding tower structure. Maybe you can see it here. It's right next to the burn tower structure. And we need this new structure to dismantle the old structure. And then the plan is to replace So we'll take down the old instrumentation and then re-instrument the site next week. So with collaborators and colleagues, we're heading up to the Northwest Territories next week to re-instrument the site. We can see here in the foreground the equipment, thanks to a local contractor who took the time to break the trail through this burned landscape and establish a nice skidoo path. And he hauled all the equipment, he built us the tower. So now next week we can pretty much re-instrument from scratch. And thanks to Merflux, we have one of the, how's it called, the fast response units. So we can co-locate the unit we had. So it was based on an Ergason EC150 for the last 10 years. So we have an Merflux loader unit that we co-locate with Lycor instruments so that we have an overlapping period and continue the data record we have for or put together over the last 10 years. So the main focus for now is on rebuilding the camp, so Scotty Creek Research Station. Right now, the site is officially closed for any collaborative research, and the focus is really led by the community, Little Q First Nation and Fort Simpson, to rebuild the site. So we want to continue with our nested eddy covariance measurements starting next week. And as you can imagine, funding is an issue. I mean, the site is generously supported by permafrost pathways based at the Woodwell Climate Research Center. I secured some funds through ongoing projects at the Université de Montréal. A lot of help from the Northwest Territories, and together with Kyle, and I'm not sure, maybe he's talking a little bit more about it. The site is now funded through an NSF rapid response research opportunity. And I think overall, there are many opportunities for collaborative work looking at the post-fire or the fire impact on how this rapidly thawing landscape functions. In addition, together with a colleague, a good old friend of mine in Germany, we are producing a graphic novel. So he's joining us in the field next week, telling the story of Scotty Creek and also the transfer of how the site was taken over by the First Nation, the process involved, the motivation involved, and we're producing a set of infographics. That's supposed to be me in the upper left over Christmas. And then, yeah, we started drawing around, playing around with different ideas, but I tried to communicate this in Zoom meetings, and I met up with him in Germany, et cetera, but it's pointless. So I asked, come with us, meet all the players and see what this is all about, right? How this functions. So he's joining us in the field next week to document this. And maybe some of you are familiar with the graphic novelist called Joe Sacco, investigative journalism told through graphic novels. And that's the whole idea about this little side activity here. So I'm coming to the end. So Scotty Creek and most of my other sites are part of CanPeat, which is a national initiative, a recently funded national initiative in Canada to bring together Canadian peatland expertise and look at and consider peatlands as nature-based climate solutions. Or it's a national initiative, 12 researchers, many partners, involves postdocs and students. And I want to close this presentation with advertising that we have a fully funded PhD position to focus on the Scotty Creek eddy covariance data record, and also work with us and look at the pre versus post-fire land surface atmosphere interaction at this actively or rapidly changing landscape. And I think, yes, that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Oliver, for this very interesting presentation. Big thanks. So please, if anyone have a question for Oliver, you can just unmute yourself or write it in the chat, or please or raise your hand, like the way you prefer. So any question for Oliver?
I saw a lot of handcrafts, so.
So I have a question. So you mentioned that there was a shift going from like boreal forest to peatlands or to wetlands. Did you see in your measurement any increase in methane flux, like that represent that shift, or it's still not yet shown in like the flux?
No, it was in fact in 2-3 papers published in 2017-ish, suggesting how the expansion of wetlands also increased the methane flux from this thawing landscape. And it was a paper in Global Change Biology and then a follow-up study in ERL. I can share them with you if you want. And showing exactly that. So the proportion of wetland increases. So this will cause an increase of methane emissions from this landscape. But at the same time, net ecosystem exchange, so NEE, is not really changing. The component fluxes change. There's more higher productivity, GPP increase, but at the same time, respiration increase as well. But the net change is zero, or almost, I mean, statistically not significantly different from the unthawed landscape, which I thought was quite an interesting finding, that permafrost thaw not necessarily might increase the net CO2 flux. Yes, it increases the component fluxes, but the net doesn't really change. So, but now with almost 10 years of data, I think it's worth examining what was, these findings pretty much based on just 1 or 2 years of measurements at the beginning.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
I have one question. So over the last 10 years, did you observe any changes in precipitation in your field site?
Yes, hold on. I mean, there was no increase. I mean, a lot of fluctuations. Some years drier, some years wetter, but no clear trend, no statistically significant increase in precipitation. But yeah, overall, clearly getting warmer, right? And active layer depth. So the seasonally unthawed part of the ground, I mean, increases overall. But then we see overall landscape changes, and it gets a lot into permafrost terminology, tailing formation. So the active layer depth in some parts is so deep now, or the active layer gets so deep that it doesn't fully refreeze. So over the winter, it freezes at the top, but it doesn't fully refreeze from below. So we have the seasonally thawed active layer year round, right? So there's,
Yeah, thank you, Oliver. So we have a question from Jing Tao. Please, if you would like to go ahead and ask your question.
I have a follow-up question. So over this 10 years, do you see, like, as simulcast expansion, do you see large change in soil moisture especially when the active layer get deeper and deeper? Because that also significantly impact the methane emissions.
yes. So as wetlands replace boreal forest, I mean, the wetland, the landscape overall gets much wetter. And if we go further south a little bit, because permafrost thaw is not just in this part of the world near the southern limit, it's not just about the increase in active layer, it's also the lateral thaw. So permafrost not just, I mean, it disappears. And then as a consequence of this disappearance of permafrost, the landscape collapses because it's ice-rich permafrost. So the ice melts, and then we have this volume change, and then the land surface collapses and it fills up like a bathtub. And these bathtubs connect over time. And as they connect, they also drain the landscape. So what we see in landscapes further south, just a little bit further south in northeastern British Columbia, so this landscape gets really wet, but then over time it drains. And then it gets drier again. Mm-hmm. So we have other species moving in. Okay. So there's this initial increase in wetness. So soil moisture, the sites are fully saturated or even inundated.
Great, thank you. I have another very short question. So do you have any snow measurement to examine the snowfall change over the winter time?
Oh, the amount of snow? Yes. I mean, that's work led by William Quinton at Wilfrid Laurier and his team. I mean, he's focusing on the snow component at Scotty Creek, and they've been doing snow surveys every winter for the last 20-30 years. So there's a detailed record of how snow depth, but also snow water equivalent has changed over time. Fortunately, I'm not familiar with I haven't looked at the latest data, right? And I mean, there's some studies, they published some studies on the change of snow depth, snow water equivalent, how it all affects runoff, how it all relates to landscape connectivity, etc.
Thank you so much.
John Gong, you would like to go ahead? Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Hi, Oliver. Thank you so much for the very nice talk. I'm very interested in the late season wildfire, and I'm just wondering, like, is that because we also see many wildfires before that during the season, but why this one is so attractive? Is that because before that the plants have evaporated the water, so it becomes quite dry during the late season. So
it was an unusually dry summer, hot summer, not many storms, never rained really, and then it was an unusually warm fall as well. And then it was the right combination of a very dry summer, a very hot summer with a dry fall and a hot and a warm fall, in a combination of winds. Right, and then there were also staffing issues because officially the fire season ends in the northwestern, is over, as many years have shown. It's over by August, September, and a lot of firefighters are seasonal. The permanent ones, they were deployed in other regions in North America that were actively burning, but also the seasonal stuff was gone. They're just hired for the season, right? It was a staffing issue really too. So unfortunately, many factors played together to, for the site to burn down. I mean, there was some activity, right, to stop the fire, and sprinklers were installed, but in the end, they weren't able to prevent the site from burning down. I mean, two of the weather havens, or the quasi-permanent tent structures at Scotty Creek, survived the fire, and that's pretty much where we start off next week. But it was the right combination of factors: hot summer, hot warm fall, and then the right combination of wind directions that led to the fire reaching the site, and then 90,000 hectares burned.
Oh, thank you.
Maybe we can just go over one more question and move to Kyle's talk. So yes.
Yeah, exactly. We need to move to
and I think
Kyle's
Oliver,
talk.
you have one question over the chat. So if you could answer.
Yes, hold on. By the way, it's important what the process was for heading the site of the First Nation people. So we're on Little Q First Nation territory. And the way research licensing works in the Northwest Territories, it's all administered in Nunavik by the Aurora Research Institute. So we have to apply for a research license, describe the project, and then the Aurora Research Institute consults with the different communities on the territory we are proposing to do work for. But the Little Q First Nation became a bit more proactive, arguing, and they established their own licensing system, arguing, okay, it's our land and we're directly affected. We want to know who's doing what. Right? They don't want to create obstacle or make research more challenging. They just see it as a contribution to understand what's actually happening on their land, to better adapt to what's coming. And so they've been marginally involved, but they're just taking up a more active role now, right? To have better control who's doing what, and to share the data with them and explain what this really is. So it's been a long process, and there's still many things to learn. And I mean, I can talk for the next 2 hours about this process. And I mean, if anyone is interested in learning more about this, I can share links and literature and explain the process. Maybe we can do this offline in the interest of time. But I've been in touch with them, and they've been also closely involved because it also says regarding traditional knowledge. Of course, their understanding of how the site works has been instrumental in the last 10 years at Scotty Creek. And it will play an important role. And they are actively involved in rebuilding the tower. So 2 of the First Nation members will be on site with us next week to get training and be part of the process.
Thank you so much, Oliver. Yasmin, I saw you have your hand raised. If possible, we'll keep the question till the end, so we have to move to Kyle's presentation. So I'll hand it to you from now.
Yeah, so the next presentation is by Dr. Kyle Arndt, and he's currently a research scientist at Woodville Climate Research Center. Due to the time limit, I will just hand over to Kyle so you can share your screen.
All right, thanks, Yumi. All right. So I will get started. So my presentation is going to be a little less on the science side than Oliver's was, and a little more of a overview of our permafrost pathways project, at least the monitoring component of it, involving flux towers and carbon fluxes across the Arctic-boreal region. So I do want to thank and acknowledge all the great members of our steering committee for this part of the project, consisting of Arctic carbon flux experts from around the world who have been a great help getting this project started. So just a little bit of background, that's going to be a little bit of review from Oliver's presentation. The permafrost region covering large swaths of the north, 15% of the northern landmass is underlain by some sort of permafrost, whether it's continuous or discontinuous. And that contains a lot of soil carbon, about 25 to 50% of global soil carbon, or an amount equivalent to about twice of what's currently in the atmosphere. With the Arctic warming twice as, or 2 to 3 to 4 times as fast as the rest of the world. Some of those most severe projections project permafrost loss to almost lose it entirely. But even under more moderate circumstances, like 2 degrees warming as agreed upon in the Paris Agreement, we're still projected to lose about 40% of permafrost. So a lot of carbon that could be released into the atmosphere. And how much carbon? By 2100, permafrost is projected to emit between 110 gigatons and 550 gigatons of carbon, which kind of goes on the scale of other major industrialized nations by 2011. And all of these numbers are not really taken into account in our international climate policy, which is like leaving a major industrialized nation out of global climate policy considerations. And why is this the case? Well, there's a lot of uncertainty in our models right now. So what we're looking at here is from Anna Virkala's 2021 paper. So we're looking at 3 different models and then the standard deviation across model products. So you can see a lot of variation, especially in certain areas in estimates of carbon fluxes. So it's hard to get them incorporated to inform climate modeling when you do have large uncertainties. And when we try to look at why some of those uncertainties may exist, so now on the right here, we have the current eddy covariance tower network across the Arctic-boreal region of active sites that measure at least CO2 in the summer. And then a site representativeness metric in color with good represented areas being the lighter colors and then poorly represented areas being the darker purple colors. And we can really see a lot of it lining up with our standard deviation across modeling products. So we have a lot of variation where we also have poor data coverage. So we need more data. And not only do we need more data, we need it in really strategically placed areas. So a little bit of background into the project and what we're doing to help solve this problem. So first, I'm going to talk about that representativeness analysis. So we're using an approach based on Martijn Plant's 2022 work in Biogeosciences, doing just this, looking at how well the carbon flux monitoring network measures the Arctic-boreal region. And we've just modified it a little bit for some of our purposes. So we're using the mean Euclidean distance between the mean of 2 sites so that we have a little bit of backup and a little bit of redundancy in the network. And then we're condensing down a lot of climate and environmental variables down to 4 principal components and doing this at a 1 kilometer squared spatial resolution. So the formula for Euclidean distance is down below with what we're using. It's basically just think of it as the Pythagorean theorem across a certain amount of space. So a pretty simple distance metric across climate and environmental data space. And the input data that we're putting in and then condensing down to those principal components, some satellite data to represent some different climate, vegetation, and wetness metrics, some soil grids data to take into account carbon levels, soil texture, pH, and then the probability that permafrost exists in those regions. And then we also are using a whole suite of climate data, some mean climate data, and then some other climate data to show climate variability across regions. So now, just with all of that in mind, just taking another look at that representativeness map, the areas that we really need more climate data include much of Siberia and Eastern Siberia, Western Russia, and then the high Arctic and Eastern Canada are some areas that jump out. And then, as I said earlier, this map is only the growing season CO2 metrics. So it doesn't even take into account the non-growing season, where much of the Arctic carbon budget can come from. So if we only look at sites that do measure year round, we get a much different picture showing that there's a lot more areas that are underrepresented, including a lot more boreal regions that really don't have that year-round coverage that we could really need to explain the carbon budget from Arctic boreal regions well. And so the goal of our project is really to not only add towers in prime locations that we need new ones, but also help upgrade and maintain towers that are really essential to the network towards getting a full carbon picture. And that's including CO2, methane, and year-round fluxes. So we're picking potential sites based on a few different ways of where we think that it may be feasible to place towers. So looking at non-operational or previous eddy covariance sites, so that's, places that they've obviously been built before, so we think that it would be possible to do it again. A populated places layer, so we're looking for different towns and villages across the Arctic boreal region, because these places would probably also be positioned at places where there would be some sort of logistical support, whether there's an airport, places to stay, roads that we could access a site from. And then we're also following recommendations from different experts, people on our steering committee and collaborators, and then also looking at scientific research stations, since sometimes these can also be placed in more remote locations, but still have some of that kind of logistic support that a town or village might have. And then we take all of those potential sites and just do a +1 at a time into the network kind of analysis. So we say if, for example, this site here in Pond Inlet or Minimetallic in Nunavut in northern Canada, if that site were to be added to the network, where does that Euclidean distance come down, or where does the representation improve? So we can look at that map and say, if we had a tower site up there, where would this help improve our network coverage? And not only can we look at and see where it would help our network coverage, but we can also just say, what is the total reduction in that Euclidean distance, or the total improvement in representation of that area? So the map can really help show where it's improving, and then you can also reverse engineer it a little bit and see what variables are helping it improve, whether this site is colder, more carbon rich, drier, other things that would really be important to have in the network and represented. Which is really going to be crucial when you actually decide on where to place the tower within a certain region. But you can also look at the mean overall improvement, because some areas, like especially some of these sites in the high Arctic, they don't represent a large spatial area, but they give us a lot better understanding of some of those high Arctic conditions. So they give us a big representation, a big improvement over a smaller area, while other sites can give us a smaller improvement over a larger area, but we still just want to kind of look at the major improvements here. And then that Pond Inlet site that we just looked at there is one of the top sites identified across Canada to be instrumented. So it's something that we already sort of talked about in our considerations with how we decide where these sites may go. Logistics, just how easy is it to access the sites? What types of other scientific infrastructure is there? Can we permit the site? Will it be allowable to work in these locations? And then, of course, strategic partnerships. So looking at that sort of representativeness analysis is not the only thing to consider. We can't just go through and pick the #1 site for each of them. We also want to think about where could there also be really interesting partnerships that can happen, because we ourselves cannot manage all the sites that we plan on doing. And where are there other interesting science questions that this could also double on a different location? And then are there existing sites nearby that maybe we can just instrument a different habitat in a similar region? Because then that is kind of a 2-for-1 as far as travel and other logistical concerns can be. And then things like the nested setups that Oliver talked about can be really advantageous towards really teasing out different science questions while also covering some unique areas. And then also just expert knowledge, if there's any other interesting reasons to research a certain place, or if it may be more logistically unfeasible based on prior experience. So just an overview of some of our progress thus far. So this past summer, we re-instrumented the Churchill Fen site in Churchill, Manitoba, Canada. So some of you may be familiar with that site that ran about a decade ago, ran by Mario Tenuta and Tim Papakairikau at the University of Manitoba. So yeah, that was the photo in the first slide. So we re-instrumented that site this past summer. And then we have a lot of sites that we are supporting to get additional year-round measurements. So some of our sites in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta in Alaska. We have a burned and unburned tundra site over there. And then, as Oliver was mentioning in his presentation, so we've provided some support for some of those towers, the Scotty Creek towers and some of David Olifelt's towers, also in northern Alberta, in that area of Canada. And then, yep, we'll be rebuilding the Scotty Creek Tower next year, as Oliver was, or not next year, next week, as Oliver was talking about. And then we're doing a tower in Iqaluit, Nunavut. So this site actually was marked as one of the most important sites across the Arctic-boreal region to have instrumented. And then we found out our collaborator, Dr. Ellen Humphreys, already had a site there. So we're working with her to upgrade that site to measure carbon and methane year-round and really get it to a point where it can be used for this type of modeling and monitoring of carbon fluxes. And then internally ourselves, we're working on our permitting and planning for some sites in the high Arctic, in Resolute and Pond Inlet, both in Nunavut. So those are going to represent some of our really cold high Arctic environments that we're really after. Resolute being a polar desert, so it's going to be pretty low fluxes, maybe even some methane uptake that could be interesting. And then Pond Inlet, just a drier high Arctic tundra site. So we're expecting pretty low fluxes, but they're all things that are not currently represented in our tower network, which can be really important when you're really trying to upscale CO2 and methane fluxes. You know, especially now, a lot of methane fluxes with how funding organizations go, they're targeted towards hotspots. So we really don't get these low flux or uptake places really well targeted, which can be really important for really helping these models understand total fluxes from areas of the Pan-Arctic boreal region. And then we are also in the planning stages of a site in Kanjik-Suluyak in northern Quebec with Alexandre Roy at the University of Quebec Trois-Rivières. So he's been really working hard permitting and doing a lot of things for that site. But as you can see, we'll kind of get a transect going up Eastern Canada all the way to the high Arctic. And that's some of our plans for 2023. So looking ahead to what our grander part of this part of permafrost pathways is looking like, we want to have around 10 new tower sites by the end of 2024. And I put new in quotes here because new also includes some existing towers that may have just been upgraded or kind of brought into this sort of tower network. So that's something like Ellen Humphreys' Iqaluit site. It was an existing eddy covariance tower for a different hydrological project, but we're just helping it measure year-round, adding methane and really bringing it up to the level of some of these other sites in the network so that it can be used for some of these modeling and upscaling purposes. And then we're doing synthesis of Arctic boreal and carbon fluxes. Some of you may be familiar with Anna Berkela's ABC flux. So there's a version 2 that she's starting to work on to increase a lot of the data in there, maybe even increase the time steps used. So a lot of you will probably be hearing from her, as I'm sure you're already inundated with data requests nonstop as people who have eddy flux towers. I know we're all familiar with that. And then using a lot of those synthesis data to upscale carbon fluxes and also model them using the process-based model, the DVM DOS-TEM model, so that we can better project into the future and use all of this to inform climate policy. And then a lot of other side projects that we're interested in as a part of this is sort of developing a best practices or just really looking into flux techniques at northern environments. You know, different gap filling and partitioning techniques may be better or worse fitted for northern environments with the unique conditions involving low sun in the winter and other factors. So we really want to, as we collect data and think about all of this, try to develop best practices on the processing side too, so that when these data go into the models, they're representing the best version that they can to really help increase improve model performance. So, this is an ongoing project with a lot of iterations, so feedback and collaboration is always welcome. We do want to hear about any planned sites or any ideas for certain sites that we likely have missed, or if you have some towers that are not currently listed on Ameriflux or FLUXNet or on any of the Flux repositories. We're always finding more, so if you want yours included and represented, please let us know. Or obviously we're always looking for more data for all these. So if you have previously unshared data that you want involved in a lot of this work, please let us know. And that is mine. I probably went way under time, but that's okay. We can leave room for questions.
Thank you, Kyle. It's a very interesting talk. I have one question. So, based on your representativeness map, we know that a lot of area in Siberia we don't have observation. Is there? I know it's hard to get some data set, but is there any chance that we can get data set from them, like Russia and Siberia region?
Yeah. So I mean, right now it's really complicated, and it's not. I would hope so. It's obviously really key data that the whole community needs. But yeah, I mean, based on that, we're just been focusing our efforts on Canada right now. So yeah, unfortunately, I'm not really sure what that's going to look like.
Yeah, I understand the current situation. There is a question from Gil.
Naomi, you kind of took my question. But I kind of want to ask it the other way around. I think we should acknowledge that as important as that data may be, the behavior of the Russian government, we should not be making deals with them or funding new towers there or whatever. Sometimes it's better not. Yeah. Some things are more important than flux data, I think.
Yeah, I mean, using that representation too, we are looking for opportunities in places like Canada or other places in the world that have similar characteristics that can really help represent some of those regions. So there are some regions that we've been looking at, like Baker Lake in Canada kind of gets a little bit similar at that. It still has a continental climate and has some similar soil characteristics. So kind of looking at instrumenting sites like that too could be of interest.
One question on chat, Ben, how about Tibet and other alpine regions?
So we've kind of kept the analysis closer to just Arctic and Boreal, but yeah, I do think that's an interesting point that even though it's technically outside of that domain, it still is a permafrost region. So we haven't yet included that, but I do think that is a really interesting point. And we have kind of stayed out of some alpine regions just because it's, when you get that type of topography, it gets a lot harder to work with.
Jing?
Thanks, Kai. Kai, excuse me. This is very great because when we take a look at the ABC fluxes data, we was wondering the site representativeness. So I was wondering, in the future, will you able to share the representativeness map for the existing sites? I assume those sites are used for the ABC flux that Anna had published, right? So if we have those representative this map, it would be very helpful for us modeler to use the ABC flux data to benchmark model performance, because then we can take a look at the representativeness map to confine the validation region, etc.
Yeah, so I am working on a paper just to kind of show how some of these new towers may improve some of the representativeness. But I know Martijn Pollant and Matthias Gökeda have done a lot of really great work on this already. And I'm not sure if their map from their 2022 paper is publicly available right now. But I would also refer to their work too, because it is, you know, really great and in depth, where kind of our data project here, we really wanted to create something that we could work with quickly to help make a lot of these decisions.
Thank you.
Yeah, Ching.
Yes. Hi, Cal. Great presentation. Thanks for showing us the progress of the ABC Flux network. And I'm just wondering, when you did the representativeness of the location or deployment of the sites, did you identify by the wetland types or like characterize it by wetland types, or it's like in general in your analysis when you do the properly when you do the PCA analysis, right?
Right. Yeah. So the kind of analysis I did only really works with numerical inputs. So I didn't include any sort of categorical variables in that way. Some of the like NDWI and the SWIR imagery does show moisture and conversely dryness really well. So we did take it into account in that way, but without the direct categorical variables. But separate from the representativeness, when we're thinking of looking at which sites are really important, I did look at the land cover classes too, to see, just kind of get a good idea of how much of certain sites are covered and how much of those sites with certain climate characteristics are covered. But it was not directly rolled into the representativeness like some of those other variables were.
Okay. Yeah, I'm asking this question because from the upscaling work, formatting, I think we can capture the seasonal cycles from the sites where the like seasonal patterns are like distinctive, but for some sites with very low emissions as well as not obvious like seasonal cycles, that would be problem sometimes for our upscaling. So if that can be represented in your network, I think we should definitely look at more environmental variables, including the like vegetation compositions, or if it's the like dynamic water, soil moisture or soil water table that could affect both the production and assumption of the microbial community. So, right.
Yeah, no, I definitely hear you that those would be really important variables for controlling carbon fluxes, but there's just not really Arctic-boreal scale data products that can really work well to incorporate at this time. So, I mean, if you're aware of any, I would love to see them and incorporate them. But we really had to work with what was kind of readily available and at least at a reasonably reliable point at this time to really put it into the product. Like, I don't even know if that product exists for most tower sites, let alone across the entire domain.
Okay. Yeah, I do have some sites I can share with you. I'll send you an email about our sites that we think we have suffered like difficulties when modeling them. Thank you.
Yeah.
Tara, maybe we can wrap up and
Yeah, I don't know if there was a pending question for Oliver. Is anyone still?
I could ask if there's some time, but if not, it's not urgent. Like,
that's
do you
good.
have-
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh yeah, so I will ask. I was really intrigued by the nested data, and I was also a bit surprised because it seemed that the difference between the just the peat data and the tree data and the NEE was not very big. So I was wondering if you have any, like why this is, are the trees not very active in that site, or like, and also if this is NEE just exchange of CO2, or is this like general carbon exchange as well?
Oliver, can you unmute yourself, please?
Sorry, yeah, NEE is just CO2, right? It's a small difference between photosynthetic CO2 uptake and respiration. You have to think about it, it's all peat. The whole landscape is peat. Right? It's not that we have a mineral upland and adjacent to peatland, it's all peat, but some has permafrost and some doesn't have permafrost. And as soon as permafrost thaws and the land surface collapses, it gets too wet for the trees. They don't contribute to the overall exchange. They don't contribute much to begin with. A few years ago, we had a paper in ecohydrology looking at the water flux. So for example, at ET, the contribution by the trees is less than 1%. And water flux, for example, is dominated by these wet thermokarst wetlands. But there's no change really in the in soil composition, I think, right? I mean, it is so these the land surface subsides, they fill up with water, but it's all peat, right? It's all the same material. And with permafrost degradation overall, you just have the re-establishment of these mosses on the plateaus, but also on the wetlands. So that's why overall the net ecosystem exchange doesn't change much, if at all. But what changes are the component fluxes. But they can't, and so this increase in GPP is canceled out by the increase in respiration. So the net is not statistically significantly different between these two land cover types.
If I can jump in, how does the greenhouse footprint change where you shift from you shift some of the carbon towards methane? Or you don't know?
I don't know. I've looked at this.
Okay, maybe so we'll wrap up this. So before we're closing, I would like just to make a small announcement. So in the Early Career Network, we're preparing for a workshop over the summer, which is going to be over 3 days. The main purpose of the workshop is to have new early careers, especially who's going to be new PIs, like running eddy covariance towers. So it's going to be kind of a mentorship between senior scientists and early career to have like this communication and to know more about how to start a site, how to run a site, how to do the processing. So stay tuned. We're gonna keep you posted with all the updates. And yeah, at the end, thank you so much for our speakers, for Oliver and Kyle, for this very interesting presentations. I thank you for the audience. And yeah, have a good day, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.